Welcome to a new series where I will be exploring the largest and most influential empires in world history, adding them, one by one, to this map of the world, until we have a map of every single empire in world history. This first episode will discuss the empires of the ancient era, starting from around 2500 BC. In total, this series will cover more than 45 centuries of history. Before we begin, what is and isn't an empire is a bit arbitrary, depending on your definition. So let me define what I consider an empire. In the simplest terms, it needs to be large and influential within the region they are operating in. This second criteria is very important. Just because there is a crazy empire around in the Middle East, that shouldn't disqualify smaller realms elsewhere from being an empire. Finally, please do note, especially ancient borders are very often disputed. The sources I used are in the description. With that set up, time to dive in. We find our very first empire around Egypt, called the Old Egyptian Kingdom, closely following the Nile River. Stretching from the Nile Delta to Sudan, this is a quite impressive starting point. But I do need to admit, with the Sahara surrounding it, these borders are just an approximation. We simply do not know how much they could push their power into the Sahara. This old kingdom would eventually collapse due to a number of reasons. Their king may have lived into his 90s, outliving all of his heirs. At the same time, the kingdom was dealing with decentralization issues as governors held more power than the central government. All of this was likely coupled with a famine, further weakening central authority. Whatever the exact reason, collapse the empire did. This brings us onto Mesopotamia, where we have a couple attempts at empire, but they failed to create lasting success. The first true empire of the region is the Akkadian Empire. The Akkadians were the first to unify most of Mesopotamia. Their empire began with Sargon of Akkad, who from a single city-state managed to conquer his great realm. Lasting for about 200 years, the Akkadian Empire would collapse for similar reasons to most empires of the era. Bad harvests, unrest, and regionalism divided the realm, until eventually being fully destroyed after an invasion from the east. Back over to Egypt, we have a new kingdom emerging, known as the Middle Kingdom of Egypt. As you can see, this kingdom is significantly bigger than the old one. Egypt has secured more permanent control over the oasis of the Sahara now, as well as the Mediterranean coast. But the heart of the empire always remained the Nile. This empire would eventually decline after a series of weak rulers, causing central authority to again decline. The death knell would come when from the east the Hyksos invaded, destroying the Middle Kingdom. Ping-ponging back to Mesopotamia, we now have the rule of the third dynasty of Ur. Interestingly, the first dynasty of Ur had been relatively small, mostly just holding their single city, while the second dynasty is seemingly lost to history. This third one now has managed to reunite many of the smaller city-states of the region. But after a failed invasion of Elam, a coalition of their enemies would cause their demise. Their successor would be Babylon. Babylon is slightly smaller than the Akkadian Empire used to be, but arguably they are more important. They would cause a shift in the center of culture in the region as Babylonian became dominant. The title of King of Babylon would gain such weight that despite the Babylonian Empire declining greatly, with the Babylonian throne falling to outside invaders, the title of King of Babylon would continue to be used for about 2,000 years by all relevant empires in the region. And this is where we enter what in my opinion is the most fascinating period in Middle Eastern history, where 5 states, arguably all empires at some point, fight a constant economic, military and diplomatic conflict over hegemony over the Middle East. The first we have already met, as it is our reduced Babylonian Empire. The second are the Mitanni, who are the first ones to eclipse the Babylonians, building a massive empire around the Middle East. They would rule for about 2 centuries before collapsing at the hand of our next contender, which are the Hittites. Bringing the art of the horse and chariot to the region, they were massively successful, usurping the Mitanni and becoming the dominant power in Anatolia, extending well into the Middle East. Down south then, we have the latest and the greatest Egyptian kingdom, creatively named the New Egyptian Kingdom. This would be the final Egyptian-ruled empire. Unlike the Egyptian empires that came before, Egypt now broke from the confinement of the Nile. interacting with the larger Middle Eastern world. As should be clear from the map, Egypt could very well be seen as the most powerful of the empires of this time. This new kingdom is also where much of our knowledge of Egypt comes from, as figures like Ramesses II, Akhenaten and Tutankhamun come from this iteration of Egypt. The reason for this is simple. We have many more sources from this period than from the ones that came before. Now the final empire of the era is the Middle Assyrian Empire. While they look small, they were such a threat to the Hittites and the Egyptians, they sorted out their differences and signed a defensive pact binding the nations together. But as far as Assyria goes, we haven't seen nothing yet. Because it's now time for the Bronze Age collapse. What exactly happened is unclear, but most likely it's a mix of events. Changes in the climate, famine, and perhaps most destructively, an invasion of the Sea Peoples from the west. Who exactly these Sea Peoples were is unknown, but they came from the west and devastated the entire Bronze Age world. Following this collapse, the Hittites completely disappeared. The Egyptians went into heavy decline and Assyria was greatly reduced. Only Babylon managed to survive largely unaffected. But it is in this post-collapse Middle East that the Assyrian Empire would bounce back, in what we call the Neo-Assyrian Empire. They rose to such an immensely powerful position, they put all of the former empires to shame, conquering or subjugating quite literally all regions discussed so far. The Assyrian Empire would dominate the ancient Middle East for 150 years, mainly due to their terrifyingly effective army and brutal treatment of defeated peoples. This reign of terror would finally come to an end as a coalition, mainly led by Babylon and Media, would bring about the destruction of Assyrian hegemony. Their collapse would laud in the revival of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, who would temporarily become the dominant power in the Middle East. These Babylonians were best known for their conquest of Judea, after which the Jewish people were taken and brought to their capital, a massively transformative phase for the Jewish religion. But Babylon wouldn't last too long. Neighboring Media was on the conquest path as well, earning the title of empire by themselves. But from their southern vassal state of Persia, Cyrus the Great was about to make even the Assyrian Empire look small. We are not fully sure how, but Cyrus gained control over the entire Median Empire, creating the Medo-Persian or Achaemenid Empire. Cyrus would go on to conquer Anatolia and the Middle East, while also pushing his borders east. But his successors went even further, conquering ever more of the east and pushing into Egypt and Greece too. By this point, the Achaemenid Empire is only missing Sudan. Apart from that, they literally control all regions previously mentioned, and they are easily the most impressive empire covered so far. Sorry for the quick intermission, but by far most of you aren't subscribed. To keep up to date with the 2 videos I release every single week, consider doing so, thank you. But let's put the Achaemenids on pause for now and discuss the rest of the world. First, the Americas, where for now we have no empires to report on. Or at least, we lack the sources to prove these empires. For example, we have the Northern Chico civilization in the Andes, as well as the Mayans in the Yucatan. Both provide cultural centers, but were they empire builders? We simply do not know. Judging by every other cradle of civilization, surely some form of hegemon came out of these regions, but I simply don't have the sources to confirm or deny. For now, America remains empireless. A similar story exists in most of sub-Saharan Africa. The empires of this region overwhelmingly occurred after the time frame of this first video. In Ethiopia, however, we arguably have the longest lasting empire ever in the Kingdom of Aksum. At its peak, it dominated much of the Horn of Africa while crossing over into Yemen as well. While there is no official proof for this, the Royal House of Ethiopia, up to its abolition in 1976, claimed direct descendancy from this empire. The Kingdom of Aksum is perhaps most interesting for being an early adopter of Christianity, making Ethiopia an interesting Christian kingdom surrounded by Muslim states for most of its history. Around 940 AD, after about a millennia of existence, the Kingdom of Aksum finally fully collapsed. Just slightly north, we have the Kushite Empire. Sudan is often sidelined for Egypt, but their portion of the Nile was just as capable of civilization. Not to mention, absolutely loaded in terms of gold. The Kushites offer an interesting opportunity where it's Sudan who, after peacefully acquiring Upper Egypt and then conquering Lower Egypt, united the region under its control. Kushite dominance would last until the Assyrians invaded and conquered Egypt away from them. From here, the Kushites would survive for about 1,000 more years in Sudan before collapsing. Moving east, we have another roller coaster of empires as we dive into China. Along the Yellow River, we arguably have the first Chinese empire in the Xia. They are an interesting entity because we don't know if they actually existed. Due to a lack of sources, nothing is certain, and that very much includes what they actually controlled. Still, in the grand tale of China, they are always cited as the first dynasty, so they deserve a mention. According to the legends, their final tyrannical king would be overthrown by Tang. Tang immediately launched us into the second dynasty, the Shang dynasty. The Shang did exist, no doubt about it, and their empire is already quite impressive. But what's even more impressive is that they lasted for 600 years as the top dogs in China before finally collapsing at the hand of the Zhou, who immediately launched the next Chinese dynasty. Interestingly, the Zhou would justify their invasion claiming that the Shang had lost the approval from the heavens, a theme that would be repeated time and time again across Chinese history. The Zhou were fundamental for the future of China, introducing Confucianism, Taoism, and legalism to the nation. Three concepts which would dominate the Chinese ways of life, governance, and religion for 3,000 years. Lasting for 789 years, the Zhou hold the record for the longest lasting Chinese dynasty. But this is not entirely fair. The Western Zhou saw the Zhou being dominant in China, but their decentralized nature eventually saw most territory lost to vassals, while the Zhou kings were restricted to a very minor territory. This was known as the Spring and Autumn period. This would further devolve into the Warring States period. As the Zhou vassals got so powerful, the emperor lost any semblance of power as the states started ripping each other apart. Eventually, the Qin would manage to completely end the small Zhou remnants before going on to reunify China under their rule. They would last a whopping 15 years before collapsing due to infighting and the death of their emperor. But even their short reign was instrumental. The Qin created the concept that China is supposed to be united, rather than unity just being a side effect of a king becoming too powerful. The borders of China were also pushed into a shape we almost recognize as the core Chinese lands, while southern China was folded in for the very first time. Finally, the name Qin spread from Persia to Rome, where it was mispronounced as China, giving us our Western name for the region. After the collapse of the Qin, we would have a new period of division, with 18 new kingdoms emerging. The most important ones were the Chu in the east and the Han in the west. But this period of division would only last for 4 years, as the Han would quickly manage to reunify most of China, before absolutely crushing the record for the largest Chinese state. The Han are fundamental to Chinese identity. The Chinese language and writing, as well as Chinese people in general, are all still named after this dynasty. Their main accomplishment was the integration of conquered people into the Han identity. They were so successful in this that the rough shape of the Han roughly correlates to all following dynasties, as well as being the core lands of the Han people to this very day. The Han would rule China for 400 years, only briefly interrupted when the throne got couped, founding the Xin dynasty. After lasting 14 years, the Han would be restored to power again. They would continue to rule until a major rebellion, as well as disloyal generals, caused the collapse of the dynasty. This power vacuum would be filled by 3 new kingdoms battling for supremacy. 2 of these are empires in their own right. In the north we have the Wei, and in the south we have the Eastern Wu. We don't have time to go into too much detail on this period, but in the following decades, the Wei would manage to take over the Third Kingdom before themselves falling to infighting. Their place would be taken by the Jin dynasty, who would then launch a successful invasion south, roughly reunifying China as it had been under the Han. But soon afterwards, the north would be pestered by barbarians and rebellions, seeing the north lost again. Still, from the south, the Jin continued to rule most of China for roughly 200 years, before being usurped by the Liezheng dynasty. This would start a complicated period of the northern and southern dynasties, where power in China was split in two. This period would last for about 2 centuries. Going back in time a bit to look at the north first, the former Qin would manage to unite the region. But don't hold your breath. They would soon collapse after losing a battle to the Jin. After another period of division, the northern Wei would manage to centralize power. These northern Wei would then go on to push the border south significantly before internal divisions saw the empire split between an east and west Wei. This split would last another 50 years. From there, everything shifted. The east was usurped by the northern Qi, while the west would fall to the northern Zhao, who shifted their borders further south. The Zhao would then manage to reunite all of northern China before themselves being overthrown by the Sui dynasty. While all of this was going on, the south had a similarly chaotic period, troubled with weak dynasties. We start with the Liu Song, who were best known for weak emperors, leading to their overthrow by the southern Qi. Their cruel rulers would cause rebellions again, leading to the rise of the Liang dynasty. They would, again, be a weak monarchy, further declining southern Chinese power, soon being overthrown by the Xin. The south was seemingly incapable of finding good leadership. So, as it's time to look at China as a whole again, the Chen would fall from an invasion from the Sui, and China is finally whole again. This is where we will leave the Eastern Giant until the next episode. Moving up north, we now have difficult choices regarding steppe empires. It's hard to say what is and isn't one in this vast area. The Scythians are sometimes shown as big as this, but due to their nomadic nature, they only controlled a small part of this directly. Other nomadic empires who look impressive on a map often suffer from major decentralization as well, as it's just a bunch of tribes uniting temporarily. Nomadic empires are often deceptively large. This looks like a pretty big state on the map, but they could never compete long-term with Persia or China. For all of these reasons, across this entire series, I will only mention a few important or absolutely massive empires in the Eurasian steppes. And one of these that absolutely does need to be mentioned are the Xiongnu. They are, depending on who you ask, the largest empire discussed in this video, and spent most of their existence in mortal competition with the Han. For 60 years, the Han would submit themselves to be tributaries of the Xiongnu, sending silk, rice and alcohol to keep the peace. Eventually though, the Han broke this status and managed to defeat the now much weaker Xiongnu, even turning the tables and making the Xiongnu a tributary instead. Through infighting, the Xiongnu would then face a slow collapse into irrelevancy. It's time to move to China's little brother, Korea. Korea and Manchuria were divided for most of this period, with no clear empires, while the Chinese were constantly attempting to control the region themselves. But during one of China's periods of division, the first regional empire would rise, as the Goguryeo managed to take over most of the region. Their place in the spotlight would last for about 300 years, before a coalition of its enemies led to its demise. This moves us down to the Indian subcontinent, which was the most difficult one to determine empires for. This is your average map of India. Due to its division, there just isn't any clear empire to be found. Beyond that, there are few sources for the earliest civilizations and whether they have empires or not. This small state is where we find our first empire, as the Magadha start their route to expansion. Their first iteration is under the Shishunga dynasty. They had already united most of northern India, giving a pretty decent start to Indian Empire. But the Shishunga would soon be overthrown by the Nanda dynasty, and these Nanda would manage to further consolidate northern India under their rule. But allegedly, they were rather unpopular. their rulers were of low birth while abusing power and setting high taxes. From the west, Chandragupta Maurya would take advantage of this, conquering the entire Magadha Empire. This would be the start of the Maurya Empire. And just look at its size. India may have started late in terms of empires, but man, did they learn fast. The Maurya would be instrumental in spreading Buddhism across Asia while ruling over most of India for more than a century. But eventually, the empire would fall into decline, with the death nail coming after a coup against the emperor, leading to the start of the Shunga Empire. But first, let's go down south to the Satavahana Empire. They had seized most of central India during the decline of the Maurya, and at their peak, they would control most of central India. While going through a lot of ups and downs, the Satavahana managed to last for more than 500 years before falling into irrelevancy. Meanwhile, in the west, after the collapse of the Mauryas, the Indo-Scythians became the first empire in India that came from outside conquest. This would be a theme that would continue across Indian history. The Scythians themselves would be destroyed by an invasion from the Parthians from the west. But more on the Parthians later on. The Shunga themselves basically started at their peak, usurping Maurya power. From here, they would spend the next 150 years slowly collapsing under attacks from outside. But in the north, a new empire was forming, the Kushan Empire. They were a nomadic confederation who would strike deep into India. But due to their decentralized nature, it would collapse relatively quickly after forming. This leads to about 200 years without a real Indian empire, until, in the east, a new one emerges. Starting small and humble, they would rise to conquer most of India again, managing to keep it together for 200 years. These centuries under Gupta reign would be the Indian Golden Age, in terms of art, literature and science, while trade also flourished. But eventually, this empire too would weaken. A Western invasion would rock the state, and the final Indian empire of this video has also collapsed. After this short detour, we finally return to the Achaemenid Empire, which is facing off against the Macedonians, led by a charismatic young man with dreams of greatness, who decided to invade the Persian Empire. You'd expect the Macedonians to lose, but thanks to military advances and great leadership, Alexander was actually highly successful against the Persians. Upon marching into Egypt, Alexander declared that he was the son of Zeus. A bit awkward considering his generals all knew his real father, but regardless, Alexander seemingly couldn't be stopped, conquering most of the former Persian Empire. What an epic and large empire, it is surely meant to last. Oh, never mind. The empire has already split up after the untimely death of Alexander. Out of these successor states, I consider two empires. In Egypt, we have the Ptolemies. This is the Egypt we know from their interactions with Rome, with Cleopatra as their central figure. While their ruling class were Macedonian, Greek monarchs, they did adopt the Egyptian way of ruling, styling themselves pharaoh. At their peak, they controlled much of the eastern Mediterranean, but their fall we will come back to later, as it is linked to the Roman Empire. Our other empire is less well known, the Seleucid Empire. It already starts absolutely massive, receiving by far the most land from the Macedonian collapse. But from here, it was pretty much just a slow decline for the Seleucids. Perhaps their biggest crippling blow came from when the Seleucids attempted to invade into Greece, only to be met by Roman legions who kicked them out. The peace treaty was devastating to Seleucid prestige, while also having to pay heavy war reparations to the Romans. Their full collapse would come from an invasion from Parthia, who took over the most important Persian parts of their empire. Shortly after, the crippled Seleucids would fully collapse. We shall return to the Parthians shortly, but first let's meet a new region, the Western Mediterranean. Here we find the Carthaginians, a trading empire that began as a Phoenician colony in Tunis, before growing to dominate the western seas. With no local threats, nothing can stop this empire. Wait, hold on. Some angry Latins just conquered all of Italy, then learned how to boat, and in a series of wars conquered Carthage and indeed most of the Mediterranean. From here, a great conqueror named Pompey would launch a campaign to the east, conquering most of that region. Another great conqueror, Caesar, would follow this up shortly after by conquering the West. The two great men would fight a civil war which Caesar came out on top in, ruling as a dictator until his assassination. Upon his death, the Roman Republic would split in two, as Octavian, the nephew of Caesar, would face off against Mark Antony, a former general of Caesar's. Egypt would side with Mark Antony in this conflict. As Octavian defeated his empire, he would also integrate Egypt into Rome. Octavian rebranded himself as Augustus while tearing down the Republic and becoming the very first emperor of the Roman Empire. Under these emperors, the state would expand to its peak, forming this massive Mediterranean empire. After the Romans adopted Christianity, it would also spread that religion across the empire. But after centuries, Rome fell into decline. Then, the Hunnic Empire devastated Eastern Europe, in the process pushing Germanic peoples into the western portion of the empire, and Rome, unable to deal with this pressure, saw the western portion of the empire collapse. The East would struggle on in reduced form, but their story we will come back to next video. The Hunnic Empire itself would also collapse nearly as quickly as it rose, as we have come to expect from nomadic empires. Now finally, we have the Parthians. They were always a major rival to the Romans over control of the Middle East, until a rebellion from the south would see the new Sassanid Empire conquer the Parthians. They would be the new rival to the Romans, and after a major victory, looked like this at their peak. But this would be their final hurrah, as from the deserts of Arabia, a new religion has sparked the rise of the first Islamic Caliphate, which would soon completely upset the traditional balance of power in the region. And spoiler alert, they will bring down the Sassanids during these conquests. And this gives us our final map at the end of the first video. This is every piece of territory once controlled by an empire at its peak during the ancient era. We can see that a lot is focused on this specific region of Eurasia, with sub-Saharan Africa and the Americas being the most notable absentees. Here is a map of every ancient empire overlaid. To make it more clear, let's make them all the same color. We can see the core of empires in this era is around the Middle East and Egypt, Persia, northern India, and all of China. This also shows why empires like Rome were so unique. Not because they were big, but because they were the first empire in a large amount of territory in Western Europe. As it stands, only 20% of the world's landmass has been part of an empire. Next episode, we will discuss the early medieval empires and fill the map up some more. But for now, that's where I'll end this video. Thank you all for watching, and to continue watching, click on one of the two videos on screen now.